The rain hammered against the windows of the Phoenix VA Center like machine gun fire, a sound that made Sarah Martinez's shoulders tense involuntarily as she hurried through the sliding glass doors. She was already 7 minutes late deliberately. 7 minutes meant the introductions were over, the circle was formed, and she could slip into that back corner chair without drawing attention to herself. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that reminded her of cockpit instrumentation, casting harsh shadows across the institutional beige walls. 23 veterans sat in a rough circle, their chairs arranged with the kind of casual precision that screened military training. Sarah recognized most of the faces from 6 months of these weekly gatherings, but she still felt like an intruder, crashing a party she hadn't been invited to. Her faded denim jacket hung loose around her 52-year-old frame, the sleeves rolled up just enough to hide the small scar on her left wrist, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel that had ricocheted through her cockpit during what was officially logged as a routine training flight. She'd perfected the art of being invisible over the years, shoulders slightly hunched, graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, eyes that looked everywhere except at the people talking. The kind of body language that whispered, "Don't ask me questions" to anyone paying attention. Double quotes, ... and that's when the "I'd" went off, Jake Morrison was saying, his massive hands trembling slightly as he gestured. The former Marine gunnery sergeant commanded attention even when his voice cracked with emotion. Lost my hearing for 3 days. Couldn't tell if my boys were screaming or if the world had just gone silent. But we kept pushing forward through that market in Ramadi because that's what Marines do. Heads nodded around the circle with the understanding that only came from shared experience. War stories. Everyone had them. Combat badges, Purple Hearts. Memories that woke them at 3 a.m. in cold sweats. Everyone except the quiet woman in chair 23, who always arrived 5 minutes late and left 2 minutes early, who contributed exactly nothing to these sessions except her physical presence. Sarah's fingers moved unconsciously to her jacket, finding the small, hard shape sewn beneath the fabric near her left breast pocket. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped, and something flickered across her weathered features. Pain, maybe, or secrets too heavy for one person to carry alone. But the expression was gone so quickly that anyone who might have noticed would have assumed they'd imagined it. "Tommy, what about you?" Dr. Patricia Valdez, the group facilitator, turned her attention to a wiry former paratrooper whose leg bounced with nervous energy. "You started to share something last week about your second deployment." Tommy Rodriguez, not the Rodriguez from Sarah's nightmares, but close enough that his name always made her stomach clench, launched into a story about a night raid in Kandahar province. Sarah had heard variations of this story from dozens of ground operators over the years, the details blending together in a familiar symphony of violence and brotherhood and impossible choices made in the span of heartbeats. She listened with the kind of attention that came from years of professional necessity, cataloging details and tactical decisions, and the weight of responsibility that came with carrying other people's lives in your hands. But she said nothing, contributed nothing, because transport pilots weren't supposed to understand the intricacies of close-quarters combat or the split-second timing required for successful extractions. "Sarah," Dr. Valdez called out, her voice cutting through the thick air of shared trauma like a blade. "You've been coming for 6 months now. Would you like to share something about your service?" 23 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and for a moment the room felt smaller than the cockpit of a Black Hawk flying nap of the earth through hostile territory. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady, a skill learned through years of radio communications in situations where panic could get people killed. "I flew transport," she said quietly, the words barely audible even in the sudden silence. 20 years in the Air Force. Just move people and supplies around. Nothing like what you all went through. The lie came easily after so many years of practice. Simple, dismissive, designed to deflect rather than engage. She wasn't technically lying. She had moved people and supplies. She just failed to mention that many of those people were special operations forces heading into or coming back from classified missions, and that the supplies often included wounded operators whose names would never appear on any casualty reports. The attention shifted away from her like water finding the path of least resistance, the group's focus returning to Tommy's story about urban warfare and the weight of making life or death decisions with incomplete information. Sarah Martinez, the unremarkable transport pilot, faded back into the shadows where she felt safe, where nobody asked uncomfortable questions about what she'd really done during those 20 years of service. But as the session continued and the stories grew more intense, Jake talking about losing his squad leader to a sniper, Lisa Chun describing the Navy hospital ship where she'd treated casualties from across the theater of operations, Sarah's hand remained pressed against that small, hidden shape beneath her jacket. A patch that measured barely 3 inches across, made of subdued colors that wouldn't reflect light during night operations, bearing symbols that would have told everyone in that room everything they thought they knew about her was completely, utterly wrong. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment patch crossed sabers and a skull, with the unit motto that had become her personal creed: death waits in the dark. Night stalkers. The pilots who flew missions that didn't exist, carrying operators whose names couldn't be spoken, into places that weren't supposed to be on any map. Dr. Valdez was wrapping up the session now, reminding everyone about coping strategies and encouraging them to call the crisis line if the nightmares got too intense. The familiar routine of departure began. Chairs scraping against linoleum, mumbled goodbyes, a shuffle of people who'd bared their souls to strangers, trying to remember how to exist in the outside world. Sarah was already reaching for her car. Keys when Jake's voice boomed across the room. "Hey, Sarah. Some of us usually grab coffee after these things. You should come." She froze, one hand on the door handle, feeling the weight of 23 gazes settling on her shoulders like a targeting laser. This was the moment she'd been dreading for 6 months, the inevitable invitation, the attempt to include her in the brotherhood of warriors she couldn't claim without breaking oaths that still bound her 15 years after retirement. That's really nice of you," she managed, her voice carrying just the right note of genuine appreciation mixed with polite decline. "But I have to get home. Early morning tomorrow." Jake's expression softened with the kind of understanding that came from recognizing a fellow survivor's defense mechanisms. "No problem. Maybe next time?" "Maybe," Sarah replied, knowing there would never be a next time, just as there had never been a first time. As she walked across the rain-slicked parking lot to her truck, Sarah could feel eyes following her through the building's windows. She'd become something of a mystery to the group, a quiet transport pilot who showed up religiously but never engaged, who listened to their war stories with the kind of attention that suggested deep understanding, but never shared any stories of her own. If they only knew, she thought as she climbed into her F-150 and started the engine. If they knew about the 83 combat missions. If they knew about Rodriguez, Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, not Tommy, and the way her Pave Hawk had looked, spinning into the Afghan mountains with a wounded Delta operator in the back. If they knew about the nights she'd flown into landing zones so hot that she could see muzzle flashes from her cockpit, or the operators she'd carried out in body bags, or the Distinguished Flying Cross locked in a safe deposit box because it represented missions that officially never happened. Sarah pulled out of the parking lot and into the Phoenix traffic, her truck's windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the rain. In the distance, thunder rolled across the desert, sounding remarkably like the rotors of a Black Hawk helicopter, carrying secrets too dangerous to share, even with those who might understand the weight of them. Behind her, the VA center grew smaller in her rearview mirror, but the ache in her chest, the loneliness of carrying untold stories, the isolation of being surrounded by warriors while pretending to be something she wasn't remained as heavy. As ever, tomorrow, she would come back. She would sit in chair 23, listen to their stories, and say nothing about her own. Because some secrets, she'd learned, were more important than the truth, even when keeping them felt like dying a little bit every single day. The Desert Rose Diner sat across the street from the Phoenix VA Center like a beacon of normalcy in a world that often felt anything but normal. Sarah had watched the same group of veterans migrate there after Thursday sessions for months. There, ritual as predictable as morning reveille. She'd always found excuses to decline their invitations, until today, when Jake's persistence finally wore down her defenses. "You know, Sarah, you're practically part of the furniture at group," Mike Brennan had said, blocking her path to the parking lot with the kind of friendly determination that brooked no argument. "Time you joined the real conversation." Now she sat wedged between Lisa Chun and Tommy Rodriguez at a corner booth, nursing black coffee that had gone lukewarm while the familiar hierarchy of war stories established itself around the Formica table. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the same institutional glow as the VA Center, but somehow the vinyl seats and chrome fixtures made everything feel more genuine, more real. Mike dominated the conversation, as he always did. The former Army sergeant had the kind of easy confidence that came from surviving 3 tours in Iraq and living to tell about it. His thick Boston accent gave weight to every word, and his habit of gesturing with his coffee mug turned simple statements into pronouncements. "You're lucky, you know," Mike said, pointing his mug in Sarah's direction with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been contradicted. Air Force had it easy compared to us ground pounders. Climate-controlled cockpits, hot meals waiting when you landed, clean sheets every night back at whatever base you were flying out of. Sarah stirred her coffee methodically, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded her of desert sandstorms viewed from 500 feet. She'd heard variations of this speech before from other veterans, from civilians who thought they understood military service, from her own father who'd served in Vietnam and couldn't comprehend why his daughter's war felt different from his own. "I mean, don't get me wrong," Mike continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he was being generous. "Transport's important work. Crucial, even. We needed you guys to get us where we were going and bring us home again. But it's different when you're actually on the ground, you know? When Charlie's shooting back at you personally." Around the table, heads nodded with the automatic agreement that came from shared assumptions. Jake's scarred hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he added his own perspective from the Marine infantry. Tommy talked about night raids and house-to-house fighting in urban terrain. Lisa, who'd served as a Navy corpsman, shared stories about treating casualties in field hospitals where the sound of incoming mortar was a constant companion. All of them had stories. All of them had scars, physical and emotional, earned in the kind of combat that made headlines and inspired movies. All of them looked at Sarah with a mixture of respect and gentle condescension reserved for those who'd served honorably but safely, who'd worn the uniform without paying the full price. Sarah said nothing, because what could she say? How could? She explained that she'd flown missions where the distinction between safe and combat disappeared the moment her aircraft crossed the forward line of own troops. How could she describe the weight of responsibility that came with piloting a Black Hawk into a hot landing zone at 0°30, knowing that the operators in her cargo bay were counting on her skill and judgment to get them home alive? Her mind flashed unbidden to a moonless night over the Hindu Kush Mountains, her bird skimming treetops at 200 feet, while tracer rounds lit up the sky like deadly fireworks. She could still hear the controlled urgency in Master Sergeant Williams' voice crackling through her headset. "Dust off 2-7. This is Ghost 7. We've got 2 urgent surgical, 1 Kia, and the LZ is taking effective fire. How copy?" She'd copied, all right. Copied and executed, and brought those wounded Special Forces operators home, threading her helicopter through a gauntlet of small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades while her crew chief called out obstacles in the darkness. The distinguished flying cross she'd earned that night lived in a safe deposit box across town, along with citations that would never see daylight and commendations for missions that officially never happened. "Must have been nice, though," Lisa was saying, her voice carrying the wistful tone of someone who'd spent too many nights in forward operating bases that came under regular attack. Flying above it all, seeing the countryside from up there. "I bet some of those flights were actually beautiful." Beautiful. Sarah almost laughed at the word, but the sound died in her throat as more memories crashed through her carefully constructed defenses. Beautiful like the orange glow of explosions, reflecting off her cockpit glass during a particularly intense firefight. Beautiful like the way moonlight looked on snow-covered mountains when you were flying a profile so low that one mistake would paint your aircraft across a ridgeline. Beautiful like the faces of operators she'd extracted from impossible situations. Alive when they should have been dead, grateful in a way that transcended words. "Yeah," Sarah managed, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Beautiful sometimes." The conversation moved forward like a river around a stone, flowing past her silence toward other topics, other shared experiences. She couldn't claim. Jake launched into a detailed description of his recurring nightmares about the IED that had killed his squad leader. Tommy talked about the weight of making split-second decisions that determined whether civilians lived or died. Mike shared his ongoing struggles with anger management and the way loud noises still made him dive for cover. Real problems. Combat problems. The kind of trauma that came from looking the enemy in the eye and pulling the trigger, from carrying dead friends in your arms, from making choices that haunted you every night for the rest of your life. Sarah listened with the kind of professional attention she'd learned during 20 years of mission briefings, cataloging their symptoms and coping mechanisms, and the particular ways that ground combat had marked each of them. But she remained silent, because transport pilots weren't supposed to understand the intricacies of post-traumatic stress or the specific weight of taking human lives in service of their country. Her hand moved unconsciously to her jacket, fingers finding the small, hard outline of the patch hidden beneath the worn denim. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, insignia crossed sabers and the skull, with the motto that had become her personal creed during 2 years of flying missions that didn't exist. Death waits in the dark. Night stalkers. The pilots who delivered operators to places they weren't supposed to go and extracted them from situations they weren't supposed to survive. The aviators who flew without lights, without backup, without the luxury of calling for help when everything went sideways. She'd been one of fewer than a dozen female pilots ever accepted into the unit, and she'd earned her place through skills that most aviators would never need and nerve that most people simply didn't possess. But none of that mattered here, in this diner booth surrounded by veterans who decided that her war hadn't been real enough to count. "You know what the worst part is?" Mike was saying, his voice dropping to the confessional tone that meant the real sharing was about to begin. "It's not the nightmares or the flashbacks or any of that obvious stuff. It's the way you start measuring everything against what you've been through. Like, how do you get excited about a football game when you've seen actual combat? How do you care about traffic jams when you've been in convoys that got hit by IEDs? More nods around the table. More shared understanding of the particular isolation that came from experiences that couldn't be explained to civilians, couldn't be understood by people who'd never faced the possibility of dying violently in service of something larger than themselves. Sarah wanted to contribute, wanted to share her own version of that same struggle. She wanted to tell them about the way helicopter sounds made her heart race, or the dreams where she relived Rodriguez's Pave Hawk spinning into the Afghan mountains while she listened helplessly on the radio. She wanted to describe the weight of carrying classified memories that she couldn't share with therapists, couldn't process with support groups, couldn't even acknowledge to herself most days. But instead, she nodded politely and finished her coffee, playing the role she'd perfected over 6 months of these gatherings. The quiet transport pilot who'd served honorably but safely, who understood military culture without understanding military trauma, who belonged at the edges of their brotherhood, but never at its center. When the group finally dispersed after 2 hours of war stories and mutual support, Mike clapped her shoulder with the kind of casual affection reserved for junior members of the tribe. "Good to have you with us, Sarah," he said, his Boston accent thick with genuine warmth. "Even if you didn't see combat like the rest of us, trauma's trauma, right? Flying's dangerous enough without adding bullets to the equation." Sarah nodded and walked to her truck, carrying secrets that would have changed everything if she'd had permission to share them. As she drove home through the Phoenix traffic, she pressed her hand against the hidden patch and wondered how much longer she could maintain the comfortable lie that protected everyone, including herself, from the truth about what she'd really done in the dark. Sarah's mailbox stood at the end of her driveway like a sentinel, its red flag raised against the desert morning sky. She'd been putting off checking it for 3 days, the way she always did when bills were due and life felt manageable in its routine predictability. But something about this particular Tuesday morning, maybe the way the shadows fell across her front yard, or the unusual silence from the nearby Air Force base, compelled her to make the walk down her gravel driveway. The manila envelope sat beneath a stack of junk mail and utility bills, its official weight immediately distinguishing it from the usual collection of advertisements and solicitations. The return address made her heart skip. Nellis Air Force Base, Public Affairs Office. But it was the embossed seal that made her hands shake as she carried the mail back to her kitchen table, the same seal she'd saluted thousands of times during her 20-year career, now appearing in her civilian life like a ghost from a past she'd worked hard to bury. Sarah set the envelope on her kitchen table and stared at it for 10 minutes, her coffee growing cold in its mug, while she fought the urge to throw the damn thing away, unopened. Official correspondence from military installations rarely brought good news to retired personnel. Usually, it meant someone had died, or someone needed information about someone who had died, or the bureaucratic machinery of the Department of Defense needed to correct some decades-old mistake in her service record. But this envelope felt different. Heavier, more consequential. When she finally worked up the courage to open it, the letterhead made her stomach drop into her boots. Annual Memorial Day Ceremony. Classified Aviation Operations Memorial Service. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, you are cordially invited to serve as the keynote speaker for the annual Memorial Day ceremony honoring our fallen aviators who made the ultimate sacrifice in service of classified operations. This year marks the 20th anniversary of Operation Midnight Phoenix, and we believe your perspective, as one of the surviving pilots from that mission set, would provide meaningful tribute to those we lost. The ceremony will be held on Monday, May 29th, at 1400 hours in the base chapel. Attendance is expected to include family members of the fallen, active duty personnel, and select veteran organizations. The ceremony will be conducted in dress blues with full decorations. Colonel James Hammer Williams sends his personal regards and hopes you'll honor our fallen brothers and sisters with your presence. He specifically requested that we reach out to you noting that your distinguished service record and survival of the Phoenix operations make you uniquely qualified to speak to the sacrifice and courage of those who didn't make it home. Please respond by May 15th with your acceptance or regret. If you choose to accept, we will forward talking points and ceremony details within the week. Respectfully, Captain Jennifer Hayes, Public Affairs Officer, 99th Air Base Wing, Saris. Hands were shaking so badly by the time she finished reading that she had to set the letter down and grip the edge of her kitchen table to steady herself. Operation Midnight Phoenix. She hadn't heard that code name spoken aloud in 15 years, hadn't allowed herself to think about it in 10, and had never expected to see it printed on official letterhead addressed to her civilian home. The memories came anyway, crashing through her carefully constructed mental barriers like floodwater through a broken dam. Rodriguez's voice on the radio. Dustoff 27. This is Phoenix 3. We're taking effective fire and have wounded on board. Request immediate dustoff to Bagram. The orange glow of tracer rounds lighting up the Afghan night sky. The sound god, the sound of Rodriguez's Pave Hawk spinning into the mountainside, rotors disintegrating against granite, while Sarah listened helplessly from 15 miles away. Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, 26 years old, 2 tours in Iraq, mother of a 3-year-old daughter who would grow up knowing her. Mommy had died serving her country, but never knowing exactly how or why. The classified nature of Phoenix operations meant that even the obituary had been carefully sanitized, listing Rodriguez's death as occurring during routine training operations, rather than the high-risk extraction mission it had actually been. Captain David Taylor, 31 years old, married to his high school sweetheart, died when his Black Hawk was shot down over the Pakistani border during an operation that officially never happened. His wife had been told he died in a helicopter crash during a training exercise. She'd never learned that her husband had volunteered for a mission to extract a compromised reconnaissance team, that he'd flown into a hot landing zone knowing the odds were against him coming home, that his last words on the radio had been, "I've got them. We're coming out hot." Sergeant First Class Bobby Mills, Sarah's crew chief for 18 months, the best door gunner she'd ever flown with, bled out in her cargo bay during a mission extraction while she pushed her aircraft beyond its design limits trying to get him to a field hospital. 24 years old, engaged to a nurse from San Antonio, died clutching Sarah's flight gloves while she held pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. 7 pilots had flown those classified missions. 3 never came home. The 4 survivors had scattered to different assignments after the program ended, bound by oaths of secrecy that felt heavier than the medals they'd earned. Sarah had lost touch with the others over the years, each of them processing their shared trauma in isolation, carrying memories they couldn't discuss with therapists or family members, or anyone who hadn't been there in the dark with them. She walked to her bedroom on unsteady legs and opened the closet door, pushing past civilian clothes to the back corner where a black garment bed hung like a shroud. She hadn't opened it in 5 years, hadn't even looked at it directly in 3. The zipper made a sound like tearing fabric as she pulled it down, revealing the dress blue uniform that represented a version of herself. She'd worked hard to forget Dot as she lifted the jacket from its hanger. Something small and metallic fell to the bedroom carpet with a sound like a dropped coin. Sarah knelt to retrieve it, her fingers closing around the familiar weight of her distinguished flying cross. The metal felt heavier than she remembered, its bronze surface dulled with age, but still bearing the inscription that had once meant everything to her. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under combat conditions. The citation was locked in a vault somewhere in Washington, its details classified at levels she didn't even know existed. But Sarah remembered every word of the ceremony where Colonel Williams had pinned it to her chest, remembered the weight of his hand on her shoulder as he whispered, "You brought them home, Martinez." When nobody else could, you brought them home. She held the medal up to the afternoon light streaming through her bedroom window, watching it catch the sun like a signal mirror. For 20 years, she'd been proud of this medal, of what it represented, of the missions that had earned it. Then she'd retired, moved to Phoenix, and discovered that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford in a world where her service had to remain secret. Sarah looked at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, seeing the face of a woman who'd spent the last 5 years pretending to be someone she wasn't. The quiet transport pilot, the veteran who'd served safely behind the lines, the support group member who listened to war stories without sharing any of her own. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her Thursday afternoons with veterans who wore their combat service like badges of honor, who shared their trauma with the automatic assumption that others would understand and validate their experiences. Meanwhile, she sat in the back row carrying medals she couldn't display and memories she couldn't share, letting them assume her war hadn't been real enough to matter. 3 weeks. That's how long she had to decide whether to step out from behind the comfortable lie that had protected her for so long. 3 weeks to choose between honoring her fallen friends and maintaining the fiction that had allowed her to blend into civilian life without questions or complications. But as she sat on her bedroom floor holding Rodriguez's medal, because that's what it was, really. A medal earned trying to save a friend who was already dead by the time Sarah reached her crash site. The choice felt like it had already been made the moment she'd read Rodriguez's name on the invitation. Her phone rang, startling her back to the present. The caller ID showed Mike Brennan's number, probably calling to remind her about tomorrow's coffee gathering after group therapy. Mike, who thought she was lucky to have served safely in the Air Force. Mike, who had no idea that the quiet woman he was trying to include in his brotherhood of warriors had earned the right to sit at any table where combat veterans gathered. Sarah let the call go to voicemail, her fingers still wrapped around the medal that represented everything she'd hidden from the people who were trying hardest to help her heal. Tomorrow, she would sit in group therapy and listen to their war stories while keeping her own locked away. But in 3 weeks, she would have to decide whether the dead deserved more loyalty than the living, whether the truth was worth the consequences it would bring. She put the medal back in its box and hung her uniform back in the closet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The letter had changed everything, had cracked open a door she'd kept sealed for 15 years. And once doors like that opened, Sarah knew from experience, they were almost impossible to close again. The phone call came at 0547 hours on a Friday morning, pulling Sarah from a nightmare where Rodriguez's helicopter was spinning into the Afghan mountains on an endless loop. She fumbled for her cell phone, muscle memory from 20 years of emergency scrambles, making her instantly alert despite the early hour. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez? The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably Air Force. This is Captain Hayes from Nellis Public Affairs. I wanted to confirm that you've accepted our invitation for the Memorial Day ceremony. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart still hammering from the dream. She'd sent her acceptance letter 3 days ago, a single paragraph response that had taken her 4 hours to write. Yes, Captain, I'll be there. Outstanding, ma'am. I'm emailing you the ceremony details now. Colonel Williams specifically requested that I inform you the service will include family members of the fallen from Operation Midnight Phoenix. Mrs. Rodriguez will be presenting a wreath in her daughter's memory. The line went dead before Sarah could respond, leaving her staring at her phone while the implications sank in. Maria Rodriguez's mother would be there. The woman whose daughter had died during a mission Sarah had been part of, whose sacrifice Sarah had never been able to acknowledge publicly, would be sitting in that chapel listening to whatever words Sarah found to honor the dead. The email arrived 15 minutes later, and Sarah read it while her coffee brewed in the kitchen. Dress blues, full decorations, 20-minute speech about the courage and sacrifice of aviators who served in classified operations. The ceremony would be recorded for historical archives, meaning her words would become part of the permanent record of operations that were supposed to never have existed. At 0800, Sarah drove to the storage unit across town where she'd kept her military belongings for the past 5 years. Unit 247 was a 10 by 12 concrete box filled with cardboard boxes labeled in her own handwriting. Flight gear, awards and citations, personal items, deployments, the detritus of a career she'd tried to pack away like Christmas decorations, brought out only when absolutely necessary. The box labeled dress blues sat in the back corner, beneath 3 other containers and a set of golf clubs she'd never learned to use. Sarah pulled it out and carried it to her truck, feeling like she was exhuming a body that should have stayed buried. Back home, she spread the contents across her bedroom like evidence from a crime scene. The blue jacket, pressed and perfect, despite 5 years in storage. The white dress shirt, still in its dry cleaning bag. The black tie, the blue trousers with their red stripe, the low quarter shoes polished to a mirror shine. Each piece represented a version of herself she'd abandoned when she retired, a warrior identity she'd traded for the anonymity of civilian life. But it was the small cardboard box labeled ribbons and medals that made her hands shake as she opened it. Inside, arranged in perfect order of precedence, were 20 years of recognition for service she couldn't discuss, missions she couldn't acknowledge, and a level of combat experience that would have shocked every member of her support group. She started with the basics, the ribbons that told a conventional story of military service, the National Defense Service Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Air Force Overseas Ribbon. Safe decorations that any Air Force officer might have earned during a standard career. But as she continued, the story became more complex, more dangerous. The Air Medal with bronze oak leaf clusters. Sarah had earned this ribbon 6 times over, each cluster representing 10 combat missions. The official citations were classified, but she remembered every flight. Night insertions into hostile territory, medical evacuations under fire, supply drops to isolated special operations teams. Missions that required skills most pilots would never need, and nerves that most people didn't possess. Her fingers paused at the Combat Action Medal, a decoration that officially recognized her participation in ground or air combat. The ribbon was simple red, white, and blue with gold edges, but its presence on her uniform would tell anyone who knew military decorations that Sarah Martinez had been in the fight, not watching from the sidelines. The Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor came next. Sarah held it up to the bedroom light, remembering the night she'd earned it. A mission to extract a wounded Delta Force operator from a compound in Iraq while insurgents fired RPGs at her aircraft. She'd kept her Black Hawk stable in a hover while her crew chief lowered a penetrator to retrieve the casualty, tracers lighting up the sky around them like deadly fireworks. The operator lived. Her crew chief, Sergeant Mills, took shrapnel in the neck and spent 6 months learning to speak again. But it was the Distinguished Flying Cross that stopped her completely. The highest decoration awarded for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, earned on a night when everything went wrong and she'd been the only pilot close enough to help. The citation was locked in a vault somewhere, but Sarah remembered every detail. Rodriguez's Pave Hawk going down in the Hindu Kush, enemy forces moving toward the crash site, Sarah's fuel running dangerously low as she made repeated attempts to reach the wreckage. She'd found Rodriguez and her crew, but only one was still alive. The wounded operator she'd extracted that night was still serving somewhere, probably unaware that his life had cost a pilot her own. Sarah pinned each decoration to her uniform jacket with the precision instilled by 2 decades of military ceremonies. Every ribbon told a story she'd never been allowed to share, every medal represented. A mission that officially never happened. As the weight of metal accumulated on her chest, she felt the familiar burden of carrying secrets were too dangerous for civilian consumption. The unit patches came last. The basic Air Force patch on her right shoulder, regulation and unremarkable. But on her left shoulder went the patch that would change everything, the distinctive unit, insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. A Night Stalkers. Crossed sabers and a skull, with the motto that had guided her through the darkest missions of her career. Death waits in the dark. Sarah stood in front of her full-length mirror, seeing herself in dress blues for the first time in 5 years. The woman looking back was a stranger, a decorated combat veteran, whose chest told the story of a warrior who'd served at the tip of the spear, who'd flown missions that required skills and courage beyond the ordinary. This was the Sarah Martinez. Her support group had never met, the one who'd earned the right to sit at any table where combat veterans gathered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "Looking forward to your speech tomorrow. So proud of our transport pilot representing the group." Transport pilot. Sarah almost laughed at the description, looking at her reflection wearing enough combat decorations to outfit half her support group. If Mike could see her now, if any of them could see the evidence of her real service history, they'd understand why she'd sat so quietly during their war stories. Not because she had nothing to contribute, but because she had too much to share without breaking oaths that still bound her 15 years after retirement. Tomorrow, she would stand in that chapel wearing the full evidence of her service, speaking about friends who died in missions she couldn't discuss to families who'd never known the whole truth about their loved one's sacrifice. She would honor the dead with words that danced around classified details, celebrating courage that couldn't be fully explained without revealing operations that were supposed to never have existed. But tonight, she stood alone in her bedroom, wearing the uniform of the warrior she'd been before she became the quiet woman in chair 23. Tomorrow, Sarah Martinez would finally tell the truth about who she was and what she'd done in the dark. Whether her support group or she herself was ready for that revelation was a question she'd have to answer in front of a chapel full of witnesses. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with steady eyes, wearing the evidence of a war that had been fought in shadows and silence. After 5 years of hiding, Sarah was finally ready to step back into the light. A Nellis Air Force Base chapel stood like a fortress of white stone against the Nevada morning sky, its traditional spire reaching toward heaven, while the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Sarah sat in her truck in the parking lot, engine off, watching military personnel and civilians stream through the chapel doors in the kind of organized chaos that preceded every major military ceremony. Her dress blue uniform felt foreign after 5 years of civilian clothes, the jackets. Weight distributed differently than she remembered, heavy with the metal evidence of her service. Every time she moved, the ribbons and medals caught the light, creating a symphony of recognition she'd forgotten how to wear comfortably. The Distinguished Flying Cross rested over her heart like a secret finally given permission to be told. 13:55 hours. Sarah took a deep breath that tasted of desert air and old memories, stepped out of her truck, and walked toward the chapel doors. A young airman in dress blues snapped to attention as she approached, his eyes automatically cataloging the decorations on her chest with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of military protocol. "Ma'am," he said, rendering a crisp salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez? Captain Hayes asked me to escort you to the chapel. The ceremony begins in 5 minutes." Sarah returned the salute with muscle memory that felt both natural and strange, and followed the airman through doors that opened into a sanctuary packed beyond capacity. The chapel held maybe 300 people in normal circumstances, but today every pew was filled, with overflow seating arranged along the walls and additional attendees standing wherever space allowed. The air hummed with the subdued conversations of military families, active duty personnel, and what appeared to be a significant delegation of veterans. And there, scattered throughout the first 5 rows, were the faces Sarah recognized from 6 months of Thursday afternoon support group sessions. Mike Brennan sat in the 3rd row, his own dress uniform displaying the ribbons of 3 Iraq deployments. Jake Morrison was 2 rows back, his marine dress blues immaculate, despite his obvious discomfort in formal settings. Tommy Rodriguez, not the Rodriguez from her nightmares, but close enough to make her stomach clench, sat with Lisa Chun and 3 other group members, all of them turning to watch as Sarah was escorted toward the front of the chapel. She saw the moment recognition hit. Mike's eyes widened as he took in her uniform for the first time, his gaze moving from her face to her chest and back, again with the kind of shocked realization that comes from having fundamental assumptions shattered in real time. The combat action medal caught the light from the stained glass windows, impossible to miss or misinterpret. The Bronze Star with V device for valor told a story that contradicted everything Mike thought he knew about her service. A Distinguished Flying Cross represented a level of recognition that belonged to pilots who'd done far more than transport supplies and personnel. Jake leaned forward in his pew, studying the ribbons on Sarah's chest with growing comprehension. The Air Medal with bronze oak leaf clusters, 6 of them meant at least 60 combat missions. The Purple Heart meant she'd been wounded in action. The unit patch on her left shoulder, barely visible beneath the angle of her jacket, bore symbols that Jake recognized from his own time working with special operations: crossed sabers and a skull, the distinctive insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chaplain's voice carried across the chapel. As Sarah reached the podium, "Please be seated for our keynote address. It is my honor to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force, retired." Colonel Martinez is one of the surviving pilots from Operation Midnight Phoenix and related classified aviation operations. She will be speaking today about the courage and sacrifice of our fallen aviators. The words hit the chapel like a physical force. In the audience, Sarah's support group members sat in stunned silence as the chaplain's introduction demolished every assumption they'd made about her service. Tommy's mouth hung open as he connected the dots between the quiet transport pilot he thought he knew and the decorated combat veteran standing at the podium. Lisa Chun felt tears starting in her eyes as she realized the weight of trauma Sarah had been carrying alone during 6 months of group sessions. Sarah gripped the sides of the podium, looking out at 300 faces that included family members of pilots who died in missions she couldn't fully describe, active duty personnel who might someday fly similar operations, and the support group that had spent months treating her like a junior member of their warrior brotherhood. Her voice, when she found it, carried the authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions in the dark. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, family members of our fallen heroes," she began, her words steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "We gather today to honor aviators who answered the ultimate call, those who flew into darkness so others might return to light." In the 3rd row, Mike Brennan felt his worldview reshaping itself as Sarah continued speaking. This was not the deflecting, self-deprecating woman who'd sat quietly in group therapy for 6 months. This was a combat veteran whose voice carried the weight of command authority, whose bearing spoke of someone who'd operated at the highest levels of military aviation. The medals on her chest weren't participation trophies. They were evidence of a level of service that made his own 3 tours look routine by comparison. Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez was 26 years old when her Pave Hawk was shot down over the Spingar Mountains during Operation Midnight Phoenix. Sarah continued, her voice catching slightly on her fallen friend's name. She'd volunteered for a mission to extract a wounded Delta Force operator from behind enemy lines. Her last transmission was, "I've got him. We're taking heavy fire, but we're coming home." Neither she nor the wounded ranger she died trying to save made it back to base. In the front row, an elderly Hispanic woman clutched a folded American flag to her chest, tears streaming down her weathered face. Maria Rodriguez's mother, Sarah, realized the woman whose daughter had died during a mission Sarah had been monitoring from 15 miles away, helpless to intervene as enemy fire brought down her friend's aircraft. Captain David Taylor flew 73 classified missions before his number came up over the Pakistani border. Sarah continued, each word carefully chosen to honor the dead without revealing operational details that remained classified. He was extracting a compromised reconnaissance team when his aircraft went dark. We never recovered the wreckage, but we found the team he died saving. 6 Special Forces operators made it home because Captain Taylor refused to abandon them, even when retreat was the tactically sound decision. Jake Morrison sat transfixed, finally understanding why Sarah had listened to his war stories with such focused attention. She hadn't been learning about combat from his descriptions of Fallujah firefights. She'd been comparing his experiences to her own, evaluating his trauma through the lens of someone who'd carried similar burdens. The quiet transport pilot had been a fiction, a comfortable lie that protected everyone from the truth about what she'd really done during 20 years of military service. These aviators flew missions that will never be declassified, carrying operators whose names you'll never know, into places that don't appear on any official maps, Sarah said, her eyes finding each member of her support group in turn. They died in darkness so others could live in light. For 15 years, their sacrifice has been honored in secret, witnessed only by those of us who shared their burden and survived when they didn't. Tommy Rodriguez, the paratrooper, not the pilot, felt something shift in his understanding of courage and sacrifice. The woman he'd assumed had missed the real war, who'd served safely in climate-controlled cockpits while he'd fought in the streets of Afghanistan, had actually flown more combat missions than his entire platoon combined. The irony was crushing. He'd been sharing his war stories with someone whose own experiences made his deployments look like training exercises. "I stand before you today," Sarah concluded, her voice growing stronger as she approached the end of her speech, not as a transport pilot who moved supplies and personnel, but as one of the few remaining voices for those who can no longer speak for themselves. "I carry their stories, their courage, and their sacrifice. Today, for the first time in 15 years, I'm able to share that burden with all of you." As Sarah stepped away from the podium, the chapel erupted in sustained applause that felt more like thunder than recognition. But Sarah only saw the faces of her support group. Their expressions transformed from polite interest to something approaching awe. Mike Brennan stood up first, his hands shaking as he clapped, finally understanding why the quiet woman in Chair 23 had never shared her own war stories. She'd been protecting them from the truth about what real combat looked like, what real trauma weighed, and what real courage meant when measured against missions that couldn't be acknowledged or understood by those who hadn't been there in the dark. The applause continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, washing over Sarah like absolution for 15 years of silence. As she walked back to her seat in the front row, she caught Mike's eye and saw him mouth the words, "I'm sorry," with the kind of raw emotion that comes from realizing you've been completely, utterly wrong about something that mattered. For the first time since her retirement, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez felt like she was exactly where she belonged, among warriors who finally knew her true name. The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt, outside Nellis Chapel like a living thing, but Sarah felt cold despite the Nevada sun beating down on her dress blue uniform. She stood beside her truck in the parking lot, still surrounded by the echoes of sustained applause and the weight of 15 years of secrets finally dragged into the light. The ceremony had ended 20 minutes ago, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. Not when she could see her support group gathered near the chapel steps, their faces carrying the shell-shocked expressions of people whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been torn apart and rebuilt. Mike Brennan approached. First, his dress uniform wrinkled from the humidity of a packed chapel, his Boston accent thick with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "Sarah," he said, stopping just outside arm's reach, like he wasn't sure she was the same person he'd been sharing coffee with for 6 months. "Jesus Christ, Sarah? The Distinguished Flying Cross? The Bronze Star with V device? How many combat missions did you actually fly?" Sarah looked down at her hands, still steady despite the magnitude of what had just happened. The muscle memory of 20 years in uniform kept her posture military straight, but inside she felt like she was free falling through space without a parachute. 83 confirmed, she said quietly. Probably more that I can't talk about. Even now, the number hit the group like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, still in his marine dress blues, ran his fingers through his hair with the kind of nervous energy that came from having your assumptions about hierarchy and experience completely demolished. "I can't believe. I mean, when I talked about Fallujah, when I went on about my 3 tours, you just sat there." "You needed to tell your story," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd learned to lead by listening. "What I needed was to hear it. All of your stories. That's what kept me coming back." Tommy Rodriguez, the paratrooper whose name had always made Sarah's stomach clench because of its similarity to her fallen friend, pointed at the Purple Heart ribbon on her chest with a hand that shook slightly. "When did you get hit? Where were you wounded?" Sarah's left hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder, where shrapnel from an RPG had torn through muscle and bone during an extraction mission in 2003. The scar was hidden beneath her uniform, but the memory of that night, the smell of cordite and aviation fuel, the weight of a wounded Delta operator bleeding in her cargo bay, the decision to keep flying despite the damage to her aircraft, and herself was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "Same night I earned the Bronze Star," she said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that military personnel discussed near-death experiences. "Took RPG fragment to the shoulder during an extraction in Iraq. Had to get a Delta team out of a compromised position. Couldn't set down to treat the wound till we reached friendly territory." Lisa Chun stepped closer, her navy dress uniform pristine, but her face streaked with tears she wasn't bothering to hide. "Why didn't you ever say anything? All those times we talked about our deployments, about combat stress, about the weight of what we'd seen and done ... You just listened." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching a formation of F-16s practicing approaches in the distance, their engines creating thunder that reminded her of Black Hawk rotors beating through Afghan night skies. "Because what I did was classified. Because I took an oath that I'm still bound by, even 15 years after retirement. Because..." She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who'd learned that the wrong phrase in the wrong context could compromise operations that were still ongoing. "Because people treat you differently once they know," she continued. "They either put you on a pedestal, like you're some kind of superhero, or they start walking on eggshells around you, like you might shatter if someone mentions the war. Sometimes it's easier to just be the quiet transport pilot who moved boxes around." The group stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what Sarah had hidden from them. This woman who'd sat in the back row of their support sessions, who'd deflected questions about her service, who'd let them assume she'd had an easy ride in the Air Force. She'd been carrying trauma that made their own experiences look like training exercises by comparison. Mike's voice cracked when he spoke again. "The nightmares you mentioned. When you talked about having trouble sleeping, we all assumed it was just regular military stress, adjustment issues, maybe some mild PTSD from being deployed. Sarah's laugh held no humor, just the hollow sound of someone who'd learned to find dark comedy in impossible situations. I dream about Rodriguez's helicopter going down, about the sound her Pave Hawk made when it hit the rocks in the Hindu Kush, about the operators I couldn't get to in time, the ones who died waiting for extraction that came too late, about flying into landing zones so hot that I knew there was a good chance I wasn't coming back out. Jake stared at her with the kind of recognition that comes from finally understanding a puzzle that had been missing crucial pieces. Your call sign, he said suddenly. During the ceremony, when they introduced you for the speech, I heard someone call you Phoenix. That wasn't random, was it? Sarah nodded slowly. Phoenix 27. That was my call sign during Operation Midnight Phoenix and the related missions. I flew with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment for 2 years. The Night Stalkers. She touched the unit patch on her left shoulder, the crossed sabers and skull that had been hidden beneath her civilian jacket for so many months. Death waits in the dark. That was our motto. Tommy stepped closer, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Sarah, I'm so sorry. The things I said about the Air Force, about how you guys had it easy with your climate-controlled cockpits and hot meals, ... You didn't know, Sarah interrupted firmly. You couldn't have known. The whole point of classified operations is that they stay classified. The families of the operators we carried don't know where their sons and husbands went, or what they did there. The families of the pilots who didn't come home were told their loved ones died in training accidents. That's the price of operating in the shadows. Mike took another step closer, his eyes wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. The tough Boston sergeant who dominated their group discussions for 6 months looked like a man whose entire worldview had been turned upside down. But that's just it, Sarah. I should have known. I should have seen the signs. The way you sat during our sessions, the way you listened when we talked about combat, the way you never discussed your own deployments. You were carrying the same weight we all were, maybe more, and I was too busy running my mouth to notice. Sarah looked around at the faces of her support, group people who'd gone from treating her like a peripheral member to looking at her with something approaching reverence in the space of a single speech. It was exactly what she'd been afraid would happen, the reason she'd kept her service record buried for so long. This is why I didn't want you to know, she said softly, gesturing at their expressions. Look at your faces. You're already doing it. Doing what? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Treating me like I'm different. Like I'm somehow more than what I was, before you knew about the medals and the missions and the FOSIG classification level of what I did over there. Tommy shook his head vigorously. Sarah, you are different. What you did, flying those missions, saving those operators, losing friends in combat that we're not supposed to know existed, that's incredible. That's heroic. No, Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions in situations where hesitation meant people died. What I did was my job. The same way all of you did yours when your country called. The only difference is that I got to do mine in secret, which meant I got to carry the aftermath in secret too. She looked at each of them in turn, Mike, with his 3 Iraq tours, Jake with his Purple Heart from Fallujah, Tommy with his Bronze Star from Afghanistan, Lisa with her combat medical badge from treating casualties in forward hospitals. We're all just people who answered when our country needed us. Some of us got to come home and tell war stories in coffee shops and support groups. Some of us got to come home and stay quiet about what we'd seen and done. But we all came home changed, and that's what binds us together. The weight of her words settled over the group like a blanket in the desert heat. For the first time since she'd started attending their Thursday sessions, Sarah Martinez felt like she truly belonged, not as the quiet transport pilot they'd assumed her to be, but as the combat veteran she'd always been, finally given permission to claim her place among warriors who understood the cost of service. So what happens now? Mike asked, his voice small in a way that suggested he understood that everything had changed, not just for Sarah, but for all of them. Sarah looked back at the chapel where she'd finally told the truth about who she was and what she'd done in the dark. Now we figure out how to move forward, together, with all our stories finally on the table. 3 weeks after the memorial ceremony, Sarah arrived at the VA center to find the familiar circle of chairs arranged differently. Instead of the usual theatrical setup with our back row refuge, the chairs formed a tighter circle, more intimate, with no obvious hierarchy of position. Mike Brennan looked up as she entered, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen before, something between respect and uncertainty, like a soldier meeting a general for the first time. "Sarah," he said, standing up with the kind of automatic military courtesy that 20 years of civilian life hadn't quite erased. The gesture sent ripples through the group as others began to rise, until Sarah waved them back into their seats with the practiced authority of someone who'd commanded respect in much more dangerous circumstances. "We're all veterans here," she said quietly, settling into a chair that happened to be in the center of the circle rather than hidden at the edges. Same uniform, different missions. But everything had changed, and they all knew it. The comfortable assumptions that had governed their group dynamic for months had been shattered like glass against concrete, leaving them all trying to figure out how to relate to each other in this new reality where the quiet transport pilot had revealed herself to be the most combat experienced member of their brotherhood. Dr. Valdez began the session with unusual hesitancy, as if she too was struggling to recalibrate her understanding of the group's composition. "We have a new member joining us today," she said, gesturing toward a young man in his late 20s, whose 1,000-yard stare and fidgeting hands marked him as recently returned from deployment. "This is Marcus Thompson. He flew Apache helicopters in Syria." Marcus nodded to the group with the wary politeness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy camaraderie. 67 combat missions, he said, as if his credentials were a resume line that needed to be established up front. "Close air support, mostly. Probably killed more people than I can count." His voice carried the hollow tone of someone who'd been carrying that weight alone for too long. "Tell us about the dreams," Sarah said gently, her voice cutting through the young pilot's defensive posturing with surgical precision. Around the circle, the other group members leaned forward, recognizing the tone of someone who understood exactly what Marcus was carrying. Marcus looked up sharply, his eyes meeting Sarah's for the first time since the introductions. "How did you ... Because I've had them too," Sarah replied. "The ones where you can't pull up in time. Where the rockets hit the wrong target. Where you watch the impact on your gun camera and know that someone's family just got destroyed because of a decision you made in a split second." The young pilot's composure cracked slightly, his hands trembling as he set down the coffee cup he'd been gripping like a lifeline. "Last night, I dreamed about a school in Aleppo. Intelligence said it was a weapons cache. The building was supposed to be empty. But when the smoke cleared, children's voices on the radio," Sarah finished quietly. "Local nationals screaming in Arabic. Your forward observer trying to confirm battle damage while you're already knowing in your gut that something went wrong." Marcus stared at her with the kind of recognition that comes from meeting someone who's walked the same dark path. "You flew attack missions?" "Different aircraft, same burden," Sarah replied. "Black Hawks and Pave Hawks, mostly. But there were nights when we carried Hellfire missiles when the line between transport and attack got blurry. When you're extracting operators from a hot LZ and enemy positions are danger close to friendlies, sometimes the only way to get your people out is to eliminate the threat yourself. She paused, her mind flashing back to a night in 2004 when she used her aircraft's defensive armament to suppress enemy fire that was preventing a medical evacuation. 3 insurgents had died so that a wounded Navy SEAL could live. The mathematics of combat were always brutal, but they were rarely clean. "Tell me about the mission brief," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the professional tone that Marcus clearly needed to hear. "What were your rules of engagement? What intelligence did you have about civilian presence in the target area?" Marcus straightened slightly, the military structure of the questions helping him organize his trauma into something manageable. Row was clear. Target was confirmed military-age males with heavy weapons. Spotter confirmed no civilian movement in the area. We had thermal imaging showing heat signatures consistent with weapon storage, not personnel. Time of day? 0347. Local, dead of night. Thermal showed the building cold, except for the basement level. Sarah nodded, her expression remaining neutral while she processed the tactical details. Around the circle, the other group members watched this exchange with fascination, seeing Sarah operate in a mode they'd never witnessed, not as the quiet transport pilot they'd assumed her to be, but as a combat veteran who understood the intricate details of close air support operations. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice gentler now but still carrying absolute authority. "You followed protocol. The intelligence was good, the target was legitimate, and your weapons employment was textbook. What happened after your strike? The discovery that civilians had moved into the building between your last reconnaissance pass and weapons release. That's not on you. That's war." "I know that up here." Marcus tapped his temple with a shaking finger. "But my gut doesn't believe it. Every night I see those heat signatures disappearing from my flare display, and I know that I killed people who are just trying to stay warm." "Your gut is designed to keep you alive in combat," Sarah replied, leaning forward slightly. "It's hyper-vigilant, suspicious, ready to interpret any ambiguous situation as a threat. Those instincts saved your life dozens of times during 67 missions. But they're not designed to help you process what happened after the fact. That's what we're here for." Mike watched this exchange with a mixture of amazement and something approaching shame. The Sarah who was counseling Marcus bore no resemblance to the woman who'd sat silently while he'd lectured the group about the hierarchy of combat experience. This Sarah spoke with the authority of someone who'd made the same impossible decisions, who'd carried the same crushing responsibility, who understood the weight of command in ways that his enlisted experience hadn't prepared him for. "I had a similar situation in Afghanistan," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the confessional tone that signaled she was sharing something personal and painful. "Night extraction mission. Special Forces team was compromised, taking heavy fire from a compound that was supposed to be empty. I had to make a choice. Leave the operators to die, or use my aircraft's weapons to suppress the enemy positions." The group was silent, hanging on every word as Sarah continued. Turned out there were civilians in the compound, families who'd taken shelter there during the firefight. My rockets killed 3 insurgents and wounded 2 non-combatants, including a child. Marcus looked up sharply. "How do you live with that?" "By understanding that the alternative was worse," Sarah replied without hesitation. "If I hadn't fired, 6 American soldiers would have died. The mathematics are brutal, but they're real. In combat, you don't get to make perfect choices. You get to make necessary ones." She paused, looking around the circle at faces that had transformed from casual sympathy to deep attention. The child lived, recovered fully, according to the after-action report. The Special Forces team made it home to their families. That doesn't make the choice easy to live with, but it makes it the right choice under the circumstances. Tommy Rodriguez spoke up for the first time in weeks, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought about it that way. About pilots having to make those kinds of decisions. Because you weren't supposed to, Sarah replied. The whole point of close air support is that it looks clean and surgical from the ground. You call for fire support. Aircraft show up. Bad guys go away. You don't see the pilot in the cockpit trying to distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians on a grainy FLIR display at 1,500 feet and 200 knots. Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah, I need to say something. All those times I talked about my Purple Heart, about getting wounded in Fallujah, I was trying to, I don't know, establish some kind of credibility. Like my trauma was more valid because I'd been physically hurt. It is valid, Sarah said firmly. All of it? Your trauma, Marcus's guilt, Tommy's nightmares, Lisa's hypervigilance. It's all real, and it all matters. There's no hierarchy of suffering in this room. But there is a hierarchy of experience, Mike said quietly, his Boston accent thick with emotion. And I've been acting like I was at the top of it for months, when really, you were sharing your truth with people who needed to hear it, Sarah interrupted. I learned as much from your stories about ground combat as you're learning from mine about aviation operations. We all served in the same war, just from different perspectives. Dr. Valdez, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of peer counseling that makes these groups effective. You're providing Marcus with perspective that I, as a civilian therapist, could never offer. Sarah looked around the circle at faces that had become family over 6 months of shared struggle. I should have been doing this from the beginning. I should have been helping instead of just listening. You were helping, Lisa said firmly. Just by being here, by showing up every week, even when it was hard. We just didn't understand how hard it was for you to sit quietly while we shared our stories. Harder than any mission I ever flew, Sarah admitted. At least in combat, I knew what my job was. Here, I was never sure whether I was supposed to be Sarah, the veteran, or Sarah, the woman with classified trauma, who couldn't talk about what really happened to her. Marcus looked up with eyes that held less desperation than they had an hour earlier. What happens now? How do I stop seeing those heat signatures every time I close my eyes? You don't, Sarah said with brutal honesty. They become part of you. But you learn to carry them differently. You learn that the weight of necessary decisions is something warriors have carried for thousands of years. And you learn that you don't have to carry it alone. She gestured around the circle at the faces of her chosen family. These people understand what you're going through because they've been there too. Maybe not in an Apache cockpit, but in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for people counting on them to make the right choice. Even when there was no right choice, Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn in his voice. Especially then, Sarah confirmed. That's when you most need people who understand that sometimes courage looks like making the least wrong decision. You can with the information you have. As the session ended and people began filing out, Marcus approached Sarah with the hesitant respect of a junior officer addressing a senior. Ma'am, would it be okay if I called you sometime? When the dreams get bad. Sarah looked at this young pilot who was carrying trauma she recognized in her bones and felt something she hadn't experienced since her retirement. The sense that her experience, her pain, her carefully guarded memories might actually serve a purpose beyond her own survival. Marcus, she said, pulling out her phone to exchange numbers. I'm counting on it. 18 months after the memorial ceremony that changed everything, Sarah Martinez stood in the renovated conference room. At the Phoenix VA Center, watching 15 new veterans settle into chairs arranged in her carefully designed semicircle. The fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer LED fixtures, and the institutional beige walls now displayed photographs of military aircraft from different eras, a subtle reminder that service took many forms across many decades. The nameplate on the door read, Rodriguez Memorial Room, honoring Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez and the other pilots lost in Operation Midnight Phoenix. Sarah had fought through 8 months of bureaucratic negotiations to get that designation approved, but seeing her friend's name permanently etched in bronze made every frustrating phone call and endless form worth the effort. Welcome to specialized trauma counseling for veterans of classified or special operations, Sarah began, addressing the group with the natural authority that came from standing, where she belonged for the first time in her post-military life. She wore civilian clothes now, jeans and a polo shirt, but the 160th SOAR unit patch was clearly visible on her collar, no longer hidden beneath layers of shame and secrecy. My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, and I flew 83 combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2001 and 2005. For 15 years, after my retirement, I told people I was just a transport pilot because the truth about my service was classified, and because I was afraid of what acknowledging that truth might cost me. The faces looking back at her carried the familiar expression she'd learned to recognize over the past. Year-and-a-half veterans who'd been told their service didn't qualify as real combat, whose trauma had been dismissed or minimized, who carried secrets that isolated them from the very communities that should have understood their sacrifice. In the front row sat Staff Sergeant Jennifer Chun, the former drone pilot who joined Sarah's group 6 months ago. Chun's transformation had been remarkable to witness. From a broken woman who believed her PTSD was invalid because she'd never been shot at, to a confident advocate for remote warfare operators who was pursuing a master's degree in counseling psychology. Her story had become one of Sarah's greatest successes in learning how to help veterans reclaim their narrative. Staff Sergeant Chun, Sarah said, nodding to the younger woman, would you like to tell the group why you're here? Chun straightened in her chair, her voice carrying strength that hadn't been there when she'd first stumbled into Sarah's office 18 months earlier. I controlled Predator drones from a trailer in Nevada for 3 years. I flew 237 combat missions and have 43 confirmed enemy kills. For 2 years after I got out, other veterans told me that wasn't real combat because I was never in physical danger. Civilian therapists told me my PTSD wasn't valid because I hadn't been traumatized in a traditional combat environment. Sarah watched the new group members lean forward, recognizing their own experiences in Chun's words. How many missions did you fly, Staff Sergeant? 237, Chun replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. And how many confirmed enemy kills? 43. Sarah let that number hang in the air, watching as the mathematical reality settled over the new group members. Staff Sergeant Chun has more confirmed enemy kills than probably every person in this room combined. She watched each death happen on her screen in high definition, knew that she'd made the decision to pull the trigger, and then had to drive home through Las Vegas traffic, knowing that somewhere in Afghanistan or Iraq, families were grieving because of choices she'd made from thousands of miles away. A middle-aged man in the third row, Navy intelligence analyst whose file indicated he'd identified targets for SEAL team operations, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah recognized the look, the dawning realization that his own service, dismissed by others as just sitting behind a computer, might actually qualify as combat experience. The psychological impact of remote warfare is only beginning to be understood by the mental health community, Sarah continued, drawing from research she'd been conducting as part of her volunteer work. But what we know for certain is that The human brain doesn't distinguish between pulling a trigger at 50 yards or 5,000 miles. When you're responsible for ending human life, when you watch the results of that decision, when you carry the weight of knowing that your analysis or your piloting or your target identification led to someone's death, that's combat trauma, regardless of whether you were physically present on the battlefield. In the second row, a young woman Sarah didn't recognize raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, I was a signals intelligence analyst. I intercepted communications that led to drone strikes and special operations raids. I never fired a weapon, never. Left the United States, but I keep having nightmares about voices I heard on intercepted phone calls. Civilian therapists keep telling me I have adjustment disorder, not PTSD, because I was never in danger." Sarah felt the familiar surge of protective anger that came from meeting another veteran whose service had been invalidated by people who didn't understand modern warfare. "What's your name, and what was your security clearance level?" "Sergeant. First Class Maria Santos, U.S. Army. I held top secret SCI with special access programs." "Sergeant Santos," Sarah said, using the woman's rank with deliberate respect, "you held a higher security clearance than most general officers. The intelligence you provided directly resulted in kinetic operations that saved American lives and eliminated high-value targets. The fact that you did this work from a secure facility in the United States doesn't make your contribution less valuable or your trauma less real." Around the room, heads were nodding as the new group members began to understand that they'd found their tribe veterans whose service had been essential but unrecognized, whose trauma was real but unvalidated, whose stories mattered even if they couldn't be fully told. "Here's what I want all of you to understand," Sarah said, moving to the center of the semicircle with the confidence of someone who'd found her calling. "There is no hierarchy of service. There is no minimum threshold for combat trauma. There is no such thing as real warfare versus remote warfare. There are only people who answered when their country called, who did jobs that changed them fundamentally, and who deserve recognition and support as they learn to live with what they've seen and done." An Air Force captain in the back row spoke up. "Ma'am, I flew surveillance missions over Iraq and Syria. I watched Americans get killed through my sensors and couldn't do anything to stop it because my aircraft wasn't armed. I've been told by 3 different counselors that observer trauma isn't the same as participant trauma." Sarah felt her heart clench with recognition. This was her own experience reflected back at her, the helplessness of watching fellow service members die while being unable to intervene, the unique trauma of bearing witness to violence without being able to affect its outcome. "Captain, I spent 2 years flying extraction missions for special operations. I lost count of how many times I had to listen to firefights on the radio while flying toward wounded operators, knowing that people might die before I could reach them. I watched Rodriguez's helicopter get shot down from 15 miles away, completely powerless to help. Observer trauma is participant trauma you participated by bearing witness, by carrying the responsibility of seeing what others couldn't or wouldn't see." The captain's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief, a physical manifestation of a burden shared after being carried alone for too long. "For the next 10 weeks, we're going to meet here every Thursday at 1400 hours, Sarah continued, falling back on military time because it created instant community among people who understood its significance. We're going to talk about missions we can't fully describe, about trauma we've been told doesn't count, about the unique challenges of serving in classified environments where even our families don't know what we really did." She gestured around the room at the photographs of military aircraft, at the plaque honoring Lieutenant Rodriguez, at the comfortable chairs arranged to facilitate discussion rather than hierarchy. "This is a safe space for secrets that can finally be shared, for service that can finally be acknowledged, for trauma that can finally be validated by people who understand exactly what you've been carrying. Chun raised her hand. Ma'am, what if we can't talk about specific operations? What if the classification level is still too high? Sarah smiled, remembering her own fears about operational security when she'd first started opening up about her service. Then we talk around them. We discuss the emotional impact without revealing tactical details. We share the weight without compromising the mission. I've been doing this for 18 months now, and I've learned that healing doesn't require full disclosure. It just requires honest acknowledgement that the experience happened and that it mattered. As the session continued, Sarah watched the transformation she'd witnessed dozens of times before. Defensive postures relaxed as people realized they weren't being judged or dismissed. Voices grew stronger as veterans shared experiences they'd never been able to discuss with anyone who would understand. The isolation that came from carrying classified trauma began to crack, replaced by the recognition that they weren't alone in their struggles. When the formal session ended, several group members approached Sarah with the mixture of gratitude and relief she'd come to recognize from people who'd finally found their community. Colonel Martinez, Sergeant Santos said, I haven't slept through the night in 2 years. The voices from those intercepts. They follow me home every day. Sarah nodded with the understanding of someone who'd fought her own battles with insomnia. And auditory flashbacks? Sergeant, you're not going to fix 2 years of trauma in one session. But you've taken the first step by walking into this room and admitting that what you experienced was real and that it hurt you. That's more courage than most people will ever have to show. As the group members filed out, chattering with the nervous energy of people who'd found their tribe, Sarah remained behind to straighten chairs and organize materials for next week's session. On her desk sat a framed photograph from the Nellis Memorial Ceremony, her in full dress uniform, surrounded by her original support group, all of them transformed by the truth she'd finally found the courage to share. Mike Brennan appeared in the doorway, still wearing his a volunteer coordinator badge. He'd become one of her strongest supporters in the months following her revelation, using his connections within the veteran community to help identify potential group members and advocate for specialized programming. How'd the new group look? He asked, settling into one of the chairs with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become family. Promising, Sarah replied, thinking about the faces she'd seen transform over the past 2 hours. Sergeant Santos has some serious trauma from signals intelligence work. Captain Williams is dealing with observer guilt from surveillance missions. Staff Sergeant Chun is going to be a tremendous peer mentor. Mike nodded, understanding the shorthand that had developed between them over months of working together. You know, when I first met you, I thought I was helping some poor transport pilot who was having a hard time adjusting to civilian life. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement instead of the hollow bitterness that had characterized her laughter for so many years. And now? Now I know I was meeting one of the most qualified combat trauma counselors in the state, someone who just happened to need permission to use her expertise to help people. Sarah looked around the Rodriguez Memorial Room at the evidence of the life she'd built from the ashes of her Secret Service. The photographs, the comfortable furniture, the nameplate that honored her fallen friend, all of it representing a version of herself she'd never imagined possible during those dark months, when she'd first started attending support group meetings. Mike, can I ask you something? Shoot. Do you ever regret that first day when you invited me for coffee? When you pushed me to join the group discussions? Mike was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Sarah, meeting you changed my understanding of what service looks like, what trauma means, and what healing requires. You taught me that some of the most wounded warriors are the ones carrying invisible scars from missions that can't be acknowledged. You've helped more veterans in the past 18 months than I managed in 5 years of volunteer work. He gestured. toward the door where their newest group members had just departed. Those 15 people walked out of here today knowing that their service mattered, that their trauma was valid, and that they weren't alone anymore. That's not something that happens by accident. Sarah touched the unit patch on her collar, the crossed sabers and skull that had once been a secret shame and had become a badge of honor. I spent so many years believing that classified meant worthless, that secret meant unimportant. It took me 15 years to understand that some of the most essential service happens in shadows, and that the people who do that work deserve recognition, even if it can't be public recognition. And now I know that honor isn't diminished by secrecy, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in silence until the day comes when you can finally speak. Sarah stood up, gathering her materials for the week ahead. I have 7 more group sessions this week, a consultation with the VA about expanding the program statewide, and 3 speaking engagements at military installations. Rodriguez and the others didn't die, so their sacrifice could be hidden forever. They died so people like Sergeant Santos and Captain Williams could have the chance to heal. As Sarah and Mike walked out of the Rodriguez Memorial Room together, turning off the lights and locking the door behind them, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work that matters. Tomorrow, there would be more veterans who needed to hear that their service counted, that their trauma was real, that they deserved to come home not just to American soil, but to communities that understood the weight they carried. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had finally found her way home. And now, one story at a time, she was helping others do the same.